Dear God, thank you for today. Thank you for all the opportunities, trials, and tribulations. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your word. Thank you for all the courage and strength to be bold. Thank you for guiding my actions. Thank you for guiding my thoughts. I pray that I stay aligned with your vibe. I pray that I'm able to diminish myself so that you be more greatly seen. I ask for guidance. I ask for patience. I ask for your lessons to be revealed today as we dive back through history lessons. I pray that we're able to be true to our mission, and I pray that the energy we put into this world leads to outcomes that bring more glory to your name. Thank you for guiding us. Thank you for protecting us. And thank you for blessing the road in front of us as you bless the one that we leave behind. In your holy name and by your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. What's going on, Tribe Network? Woo! It's me, Richard Maxwell, TribeChief. We are here today on a beautiful but very cold January day, January 27th. It is cold. The low today is like -5. The high is like 11 degrees. The wind chill is probably impacting that in some way, shape, or form. And it's a cold one out there. So bundle up and be safe. If you got hit by that storm recently, watch out. Hopefully you and yours have power and have what you need. If not, we're praying for you. We're hoping that, the warmth finds you. If we can entertain you in the meantime, hopefully we can do so. We can learn something in the meantime. Hopefully, we can help you with that. So it's good to see everybody today. Good to be back. Roads out here are bad enough where work has been canceled. They're saying don't come in if the roads don't feel safe. And I've had a couple times driving to and from work where I've gone into the ditch. Been facing the wrong direction on a highway with a semi coming at me while icy conditions are around. So I don't fuck around. You tell me I don't have to come in, you don't need me. I'm out there, man. I ain't gonna drive out in this weather if I don't have to. It's just how I go about it, alright? That's how I go and handle my business, alright? So, guys, I hope you guys are having a fabulous day. We woke up today. We had a good day. We've been working with AX JPEG to get some stuff edited. He's doing a great job. Welcome to the Tribe AX JPEG. That's going really well. Let me share this morning's journal entry with you guys. So, January 27th, 2026. The quote of the day comes from John Bon Jovi, legend. Miracles happen every day. Change the perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you. Again, that's by John Bon Jovi. And that's an interesting, I like the way he thinks, change your definitions and your standards of what a miracle is. It doesn't have to be something that impossible happens, but maybe you need to look at the things that happen every day, and we start taking them for granted, Coming all the way back to gratitude on that one. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you. I can't think of the movie, but it might be like Bruce Almighty even. When you talk about miracles and why have you done anything, he's like, you need to look at the miracles of a single mother who gets through a day working 2 jobs, coming home with 3 kids, and it's a miracle that she has the energy to put food on the table. And especially nowadays with like technology and how fragile our infrastructure really is, it's a miracle that we're able to be warm and have all this capacity to talk and communicate and spread information around. It's definitely a miracle the times that we live in. Today I'm grateful for a family to cook for. I cooked everyone breakfast this morning. Knowing what needs to be done, having clarity of what I need to do on a day-to-day basis, and I'm very grateful for having such a wonderful wife. She just brings me so much joy and peace that I'm just going to be eternally grateful to her for my entire life. What would make today great? Getting an hour in on the treadmill, getting a stream in, and getting work done. I will be honest, it's been a very productive morning. We got some homework lectures knocked out. We've got some content again planned and created with old AX JPEG. Shout out to the goat. And then we also laid out some framework for how we need to have the database and Tribe Vibe Network like operating system in terms of how we get data economics done. We got some design working on that. You might be able to see a little bit of that work on the whiteboard there. And then, Claude gave me something to base everything off of. He just gave me like 26 pages, and it's like formatted well, and all of it makes sense, but we got to like go through it and repurpose it a little bit. It gives me a template to work off though, so I'm grateful for that. And then my daily affirmation: I am a great father. I will achieve the mission, and I will redefine what it means to be a CEO. Woo! Tribe Vibe! Welcome, baby! Tribe Vibe Network. We are a tribe of purposeful individuals coming together on a common higher vibration, networking together to create better business practices in order to leave the next generation better off so that they can be better than we imagine. It has been a heck of a day, heck of a time. We got to stream yesterday. It was a little bit more unstructured. Hopefully today we can be a little bit more structured with what we're trying to do. Even with that journal entry, we're trying to get a consistent intro going. But what we are going to be doing today, so I have been wanting to get back onto, when we first started the stream, if you were here back then, which I know very few of you were, shout out to S. Sorrentos. Back then, I was doing a lot more history streams. I was talking about like World War One. I think I was actually starting like with like the Great Depression and moving forward. And there's a lot of like parallels to history. Like we talk about like how fascism is back around today, and we talk about how just how there's nothing new under the sun. Capitalism's been here for a while. These different forces have been here for a while. The rich and the society benefiting the few. That's been around since there's been a system to take advantage of. So I wanted to get back into my history bag. I wanted to let that be a little bit more of where we base a lot of our stuff on. Reaction content's great, and I'm sure there will be times where I react, especially with like vibe checks when I'm trying to check out a creator. I would love for my community to bring me somebody to like react to. That'd be an awesome place to get to. But in some ways, I really want to focus on like primary sources of information, and like when that's not possible, like today we're not going through like all primary sources of history. Again, a primary source being something that doesn't have a filter on it, like an autobiography would be considered a primary source because it's written from the hand of the subject matter, whereas like a secondary source would be a biography that was written after the fact. Especially like degrees of secondhandness, like a biography that was written like directly after, directly like in the moment. Like, if you look at something like MLK or Martin Luther King Jr. or someone like that. I think I said the same name nice. I was thinking Malcolm X and MLK because I'm reading Malcolm X's autobiography right now. When you look at that, it's like something to consider that like, how, autobiography is a primary source because it's coming straight from the subject matter, where a secondary source, there's degrees to it. Someone who, might get infatuated with the civil rights movement and what it means in 2026 can go back and technically write a biography on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. with their their filter, their bias, and typically if you're doing it in good earnest, and like earnestly and honestly, you would like find a different perspective or find some new source material that hasn't really been written on. But secondary source is always something like after the fact. Primary sources are things that like if you have video of the time, like primary source for what happened this past weekend in Minnesota would be like camera footages that are coming like straight off of like Alex's phone or off like the witnesses right off that phone. A secondary source would be watching a content creator go over that source and give you like opinions and bring in other informations to like recontextualize things. So I do want to be more about primary sources. I do want to like give that version of like literacy and understand the media a little bit more. But I also want to get back into like history, and I want to focus on like how we got to this point, because I think it's so many times like we don't ponder, we don't push our imagination, our ability to like conceive something or hold like a big thought in our head, and I think it kind of shrinks our our focus is already shrinking, but like our ability to think of variables over like long periods of time sometimes. We just don't have a lot of places of having like conversations like that, or times to like just have the fun and enjoy like the mental gymnastics of seeing how much you could hold and what you're pondering about. So I want to dive back into history because that's what history is to me. It's about like thinking about how society got here and really trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and like try to think about what their life would have been like at that time. and try to think about how, not just like how their life would have been, but how did their life impact me, and not like in a selfish way, but like because like that's like thinking about your impact. Like you are just just wrinkles of vibration that are just going to echo throughout time. You know what I mean? Like you throw a rock into a pond and you see those rings go, like that's your vibration going out into society. Like depending on how concentrated and how big of an impact and like what your vibe is all about, you can have a lasting impact for many years. But that's very rare for an individual. If like we could even argue if ever, but the the souls, like when a culture is doing something in a certain way, or society is moving a certain way, or evolution takes place in a certain way, those rings echo for generations. And sometimes we forget about like the ground zero effect of like why it happened or when it happened or what it took for it to happen. We start taking, like just like that quote earlier, we start taking that for granted because we don't consider it a miracle anymore, even though it was a miracle for the time. So originally I was thinking we would um, originally I was thinking we would, because World War II, of course, that's like the making of America. That really prime, you get into like post World War II and modernism. We're really starting to get into, you're really starting to get into like what built America, our modern economic system, our modern like global power landscape. All that kind of comes like post World War II, post the Cold War, but even like the Cold, even like with Russia being a superpower right now. Like I mean, that's still the seeds of like World War II and like all the landscape that happened after Israel, all the landscape division that happened post that came from World War II. So I was thinking like, well, let's start with a. My original thought was let's start with let's go around region to region. From Asia to Europe to the Americas to Latin America to Africa, and let's like really think about like where the everyone's economy was. Let's see because like what is economy? It's how civilization, it's like the spending of energy in an ecosystem, right? That's what economy is. So I was thinking like let's dive in, let's check out what everyone was doing, 1930, 1935, how everyone's economy was. I was thinking about like the basics of that too when I originally thought it. Then I started stretching the idea a little bit because like we know Germany is under sanctions from World War One. We know that France and Britain really don't care to get back into war. They're not really stopping Germany in the lead up to World War Two. We kind of covered all that. We know America's like coming out of the Great Depression. But then, I was thinking about like, well, we got to talk about Africa because like Africa's like where a majority of the war gets fought, even like in North Africa. Like some of the first battlegrounds between Axis and Allied powers happens in Northern Africa. So I'm like, well, let's dive into Africa. But then like diving into like African history, like the history of like the continent of Africa in 1930s is like a wild place to jump in because it's so colonialized. You have eras of like, you go to like Egypt, and you even go like before that, you go to like ancient history, and like some of the richest empires ever have been in Africa. But when you jump into them in the 1930s, they're mostly like the area is mostly colonized, and it's really backing up like the French, the German, the Dutch like economies, and making those economies what they really are. So, all that being said, what I decided that we are going to do is we are going to do a study of the continent of Africa's history. We found this beautiful video that we will get into, made by, I'm going to mess his name up because that's who I am, Jabzy. It's 3 hours and 30 minutes long, and it goes from the 16th to the 20th century. And I think in the thumbnail it even says it ends in like 1930. So it's going to lead us up to right what we're talking about with like going into World War II, and to give us more context for how each of the players in that war, what their economies were really truly built on, and where where their economies were truly built on, but then like the philosophies that got their economies built in that fashion. You know what I mean? Like I'm always yelling about like people in charge don't care about shit unless shit's on their shoes, and let's get to the root of that. Like that's not something that we're just now dealing with for the first time ever in 2026 in America with like our financial inequality. That's why economists and other leaders and academics have been warning about this for such a long time, is because like this is a pattern throughout history. So let's get into that pattern a little bit. We're gonna get into like, I mean, we're not gonna call it the origin, but like if you think about the Dutch East Empire, Dutch East Indies being like the first like version of capitalism, like a modern version of capitalism, that starts in 1602, and their era kind of ends in like 1799 is when they're dissolved, right? So what we're really talking about is like the 60 years. I think we're going to start. But I'm not really sure where he's starting, but like with that being like the 1602 to 1799, that is like the beginning of capitalism. Like that's like where the capitalist crown from one of the very first videos we watched like was birthed and like created. So when you get into like the 1900s and the 1930s, we're talking about like 130 years post the first like capitalist economic system being like founded and created, right? So we're gonna see how that plays an impact. Let me not discourage too much narrative or go too far into all that until it gets revealed. Let me review my notes real quick, make sure I didn't miss anything. The other aspect of why I started Africa is that's where like human history starts, and like I don't think the history of like when I keep saying African, I mean like the continent of Africa, like the people that grew everything that encompasses, but like, we don't study the history of Africa enough, and I think like that's a shame in like Western thought. Like we just consider the Nile and Egypt to be one of the only civilizations and empires to mention throughout our telling of history and how we look back on history. So let's see what that looks like. Let's just see what we can find and how that can come about. Modern global wealth started in Africa. European industrial power was built on African resources and labor. Literally, the Industrial Revolution, World War I was a test of like, hey, we can now like mass make these arms and armament and kill people more efficiently than ever. And World War II was like, hey, now we put tech boosts on top of that. Let's see what we can really get into. We put like the highest forms of engineering into like how to kill people. So let's see what that can turn into, and all the economy that led to that industrialization, and like the resources that created the guns, that created the tires, that created all those things, came straight from like the resources and labors from Africa. So we're gonna dive in and see like one thought I kept thinking of every time I'm like starting in Africa. It's like the empires of the world were built on like the resources and economy that flew from Africa. So like they are the foundation to like not our modern problems, but like they gave us the materials to build the societies that we live in today. And a lot of these patterns are still happening even to this day. And like this is where the pattern really started. Like Africa was, especially you think about like free press and stuff. Like being able to read and spread information was like a key in like raising the living standards within like European towns and cities. But if like out of sight, out of mind, and like especially when colonization first started, like there was no world organizations that were checking that like on like humanitarian standards. So we'll be checking that out. Some of the key things that we're going to be learning. How the scramble for Africa, which took place from the 1880s to 1914, created the wealth that funded the European powers going into the wars in 1935, and how that all happened. Where wealth was extracted versus where it was accumulated, meaning like where was that resource, and like where did the money end? Like where did it start to pool in its capitalistic ways? And that is a core pattern for global capitalism to this day. Why after African kingdoms fell, how Africans resisted, and what this tells us about power. And then finally, economic concepts that will shape our world, extraction economics, colonial capitalism, and resource curses. So let's go ahead and get into some of those little vocab terms. Let me pull this up on the screen so you guys can read it and not just rely on hearing me say it. I know I speak quickly and I'm always stuffed up, which always makes me congested, which just gives me that nasally sound. One quick second. Douche. So, This is where we started. So some key economic concepts. We will learn these now. We will use them throughout our history binge. And I don't plan on stopping here. This is our first big module. This is our first big section that we'll be moving through. Key economic concepts. These terms explain how wealth moves in the world. You'll see these patterns repeat across history. Extraction economy, which is mentioned on our website. We are one of the things that we're doing here with data economics is trying to oppose extractive capitalism to this day. This is a huge problem in our society. The definition is economic system where raw materials, gold, rubber, oil, minerals are taken from one place and wealth accumulates somewhere else. An Africa example, Belgian Congo extracted rubber, processed in Belgium, profit stayed in Europe, African workers got subsistence wages. This is, even this quick definition does not go into the true brutality and inhumanity that was taking place in the Congo. A modern example would be like cobalt mines in the DRC. Batteries are made in China, phones sold globally. Congolese miners are still in poverty with no infrastructure. We are still just relying on people's good hearts to fundraise money to take on anything in that, if we even are allowed to hear about it or talk about it at all. Resource curse, which is, of course, there's an African example, but this is also a big thing that we've done in Latin America. The definition is the paradox where countries with valuable natural resources often have worse economies, more corruption, and lower living standards. Why this happens? It's easy resource wealth discourages other industries, attracts foreign interference, funds corrupt governments, creates boom and bust cycles. A lot of that, again, this is like regime change. Regime change is the reason that happens is a lot of this easy resource wealth discouraging other industries. If you get a leader that's coming in and trying to create other industries to make their economy more diverse and with a little bit of variety in it, so it doesn't have to be so dependent on one version of one market, you start creating a complex economy. You start becoming less reliant on your colonizers. If I don't need you to go take something to market so that we can have some money and we can have an economy that doesn't necessarily need to rely on any one market, now whether you're here or not to bring this to market for whatever we're getting out of it, then if I don't have to rely on you, I can turn away from it. I can put my labor somewhere else. I can regulate against it. If you threaten to take this market away and boycott this on the global stage, it doesn't matter because we still have jobs. We still have an economy that can pumping. That energy isn't getting wasted. There's still other places for that labor and that energy to go get value. If that labor and energy go get value somewhere else, I can turn my labor force away from whatever resource is making somebody else rich. I can get rich and dependent on myself. And now, heck, you can start getting to that point. We can uprise and start nationalizing this resource that someone else is trying to make money off of. Again, terrible for the colonizer. The Africa example, Nigeria has massive oil wealth, but 40% poverty rate. The DRC has $24 trillion in minerals, but is one of the poorest countries. Wild. Colonial capitalism is another term. The definition. I'm sorry, guys. Colonial capitalism, the next term, is the definition. The definition is the economic system where colonizing country controls trade, sets prices, owns the infrastructure, and ensures wealth flows back home. Again, they're the ones benefiting and keeping this resource curse a natural thing. If it wasn't for the colonial capitalists, well, I guess you could still have a dictator who doesn't care about their country. I guess it's not dependent on colonialism, but typically these two are peas in a pod. Key feature, colonial forces to sell raw materials cheap to colonizer, then buy expensive finished goods back, double the exploitation. Modern eco Neocolonialism, former colonies still economically dependent on old colonizers through debt, trade agreements, currency control. And again, I know that's another Latin American thing that we've used in the past. We've done that to Latin American nations. Divide and rule definition strategy where colonizers favor one ethnic group or, religious group over others to prevent a unified resistance. The economic impact of that creates artificial hierarchies, destroys cooperation, ensures colonized people fight each other instead of the colonizer. I would say this is, in today's world, American example would be red and blue. If you're on Team Red and you just want to see Team Blue lose, or if you're on Team Blue and you just want to see Team Red lose and you're not using your own critical thinking skills to think about who's benefiting from the fact that we aren't being focused on our real problems, then, I would say this is how the American system is the American domestically is being controlled. But an Africa example, Belgians favored Tutsis over the Hutus, and Rwanda led to 1994 genocide. British favored certain Nigerian groups, fuels conflict to this day. Okay, we're almost there. Whew. Forced labor, unpaid or underpaid mandatory work, usually justified through taxes or legal requirements. And how this has worked in the past is the Hut tax forces Africans to earn money. Only way to earn is to work for colonizers, and it's essentially slavery with extra steps. We're going to put you on a slave wage where you can't make enough money to own what you need to own to live, so you'll always have to work for us. And then, through taxation, we're really paying ourselves through you. A modern echo would be like the prison labor that we're dealing with today, debt bondage, student debt, exploitative gig economy, different forms of coerced labor. Coerced labor? Coerced? Is that what that is? Let's double check. Yeah, okay. Coerced labor. Cash crop economy. The definition of that is agricultural system focused on crops for export, such as cotton, cocoa, coffee, and rubber, rather than food for local consumption. Again, you're more worried about making another nation rich instead of feeding your own people and taking care of your own people. The problem when you grow coffee instead of food, you're dependent on foreign buyers for income and foreign imports for food. Anytime you don't have food and you have to bring food in and you're dependent on this, again, you don't have a diverse economy. You're, just the logistics of getting things back in the day sold and then money back to buy things could have been a process that would have caused like famine or like, malnutrition. An example, Uganda forced to grow cotton. There's a food shortage, must import food, trapped in a cycle of dependency. And then just something to keep in mind, every story in this module demonstrates one or more of these concepts. When you see rubber extraction in the Congo, gold mining in South Africa, or cotton farming in Uganda, you're seeing these economic systems in action. These same patterns repeat globally and continue to this day. Ooh, yeah. The big picture. Africa before the scramble. Let me see this real quick. So we'll get into this real quick because this is going to set the stage for the first part of the video we're going to watch. Many people think Africa was empty or primitive when Europeans arrived. It's completely false. Africa had some of the most powerful kingdoms, sophisticated trade networks, and complex political systems for thousands of years before then. Some of the African kingdoms and empires before the scramble for Africa were the Kingdom of the Congo, which was a Christian kingdom and even had an ambassador that was sent to the Pope in Rome. Some of the cities were larger than some of the cities that were in Europe. The Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, was possibly the richest man in history. Timbuktu was the center of learning. There's legends that when Mansa Musa went to travel across other empires and kingdoms in his time, he would travel with so much gold and give so many gifts away, he would cause inflation to the to the places he visited. He would throw their entire economy back by flooding them with gold and money, which is just a crazy amount of wealth. Wait, am I right about that? I'm pretty sure it's Mansa Musa. It was possibly the richest man in history. Yeah, I'm Kingdom in advanced metalwork, massive city walls, sophisticated government. Shanti Empire, sorry if I'm saying any of these wrong. Controlled gold trade, well organized military, complex legal system. Ethiopia had an ancient Christian kingdom, built stone churches in the 12th century, and it was never fully colonized. Crazy that like Christianity goes beyond like Western government and Western cities and rule and Western like philosophy and thought. It's kind of interesting how we think it's a 1-to-1 that they mean the same thing, but it couldn't be further from the truth. So Sokoto Caliphate, one of the largest empires in Africa, controlled much of West Africa. And then the Zulu Kingdom had a powerful military and it defeated British forces multiple times before falling. So here are some of the questions that we're going to look at. We're going to see what changed. Some questions to keep in mind for the first part of this video. Economic depression, panic of 1873. Europe needed new markets and new resources. This is why the scramble happened. New technology, Maxim guns, steamboats, telegraphs made conquering easier and cheaper. These aren't the questions. I apologize. New colonial powers, Germany, Belgium, Italy, unified recently and wanted empires. Competing between powers, fear that rivals would claim territory created a feeding frenzy for the colonizers at the time. And then a weakened African state, slave trades and destabilization. Many kingdoms were in the middle of civil wars. Here are the questions. Why did Europeans stick to the coast for 200 plus years? How did the slave trade weaken African kingdoms before colonization even started? And where did wealth from the slave labor go? So those are going to be our first discussion questions. We're going to go ahead and get into the video. Let's go ahead and pull that up. Again, this is by Jabzy. Sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Shaleas, please. This was made 3 years ago and has 10 million views. I'm trying my best to like source this. I looked through it. I backed up some of the stuff and claims and history points, and even sent it through AI to see what AI would say about it. From everything I can see, it's a pretty solid video. Obviously, reading a book and diving into something that had like more, you can have more context. Obviously, would be the best, but this is the best for the situation. So let me go ahead and flip my screen a little bit.
The scramble for Africa is, I believe, one of the most poorly understood periods in history. From what I gather, most people seem to believe that the colonial powers one day sat around a map at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders around bits they wanted, and that was it. But the scramble had already begun by the time of the conference of 1884, plus the conference stated that any claimant must show effective occupation of a region before it was granted to them. This meant in some instances there were literal races between explorers, far more intense than just drawing lines on a map. During the scramble, great powers like Britain and France nearly went to war. It brought about a revolution in Portugal, and, I'd argue, with the exception of maybe the Zulus and Ethiopians, the Africans and their battles against colonialism are often just completely ignored. Plus, the fact that some African countries like Egypt and Ethiopia actually expanded is also often glossed over. But to understand the scramble, you really need to go back in time. Well, maybe you don't, but there's some fascinating empires, wars, and cultural exchanges beforehand. The first European colonies in Africa were set up by the Portuguese, as bases along their route to India. These included Madeira in the Atlantic, Sofala in Mozambique, Luanda in Angola, and Mombasa and Zanzibar in East Africa. These all proved to be important stopover points for international trade, and this was pretty much the standard for colonialism at that time. It was far more profitable to set up factories for trade and control sea lanes, rather than taking over entire regions. As such, the Portuguese would also set up colonies in the Spice Islands, Hormuz in Persia, and, important to this story, in Oman. The Spanish and Portuguese had agreed to divide the world in two, so they had little competition from Europeans in Africa. But late in the 16th century, the Iberian Union united Portugal with Spain, and as such, the Portuguese entered into Spain's wars against the Dutch and the English. The Dutch were quick to move into the colonial game and took Mina from the Portuguese. They expanded in West Africa, established the Dutch slave coast, and built forts in Senegal. Plus, for a few decades, they even held Portuguese Luanda. While in the south, in the middle of the 17th century, they entered Cape Town, an important midway point for ships sailing between the oceans. The Dutch that settled in this region became the Boers. However, the locals in South Africa that they encountered during this period were not the Zulu, they were the Khoekhoe. These are often grouped together with the San hunter-gatherers, but they were a distinct group of people. The Zulu, on the other hand, didn't enter the picture for another few decades, as they were Bantu who migrated from the north. However, to further complicate matters, there were also the Xhosa in South Africa at that time, and they are closely related to the Bantu. There is some debate over when the Xhosa arrived, but their language shows that they may have been there a lot sooner, as they adopted some of the click sounds from the local San people. Hence Xhosa is usually pronounced something like Ngosa. But I think it's time to explain a bit about the African people and their kingdoms. So this is going to be a gross oversimplification.
I always think it's interesting that we don't talk a lot about like you know, I mean, and maybe we do, and maybe, you know, it's just not as like glorified or held as much prestige. But like human history started in Africa. There's more, so that means that there's like more human history that's happened in Africa than anywhere else. And it's crazy to think that like the different ways like what people valued in the civilizations that came and spread and came and went and like mixed together, like I mean like even like pre-Egypt, like the going into that, it's such like a fruitful like so much like experience, so much like culture like that, like we'll never know. And like I like to think of conspiracy theories a little bit sometimes, and like not knowing what has been there or like what level of civilization they were able to execute at any one point in time is kind of crazy. Like of course like they didn't have a society like ours, but like our society is also like propped up on like wasteful consumption, production, exploitation. Who's to say our society is like the best version that's ever came out? You know, I know that's like a wild talk, but like, you know, it depends on how you're grading everything. And like, of course, they couldn't do like a heart transplant, but you know, I don't know. It's just something that it just opens the box to like the unknown a little bit. You know, that's all.
Aware of that, as I'm trying to explain about 200 years of African history, but here goes. Let's start with the Bantu. They originated probably from Cameroon, and they migrated south and east. This migration lasted potentially thousands of years, so don't think of it like a mass movement of people. They became the dominant group in many countries in Central and South Africa over time, but they often lived alongside the original inhabitants. So in South Africa, and especially in Namibia, you still have the San people. Plus, alongside the Bantu in Congo, you have the Pygmies. Plus, it was the Bantu who established the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa. And this kingdom in the early 1600s sent an ambassador to meet with the Pope in Rome. He was Emmanuel.
Isn't that crazy? From all the way down there, all the way up to Italy, there was an ambassador from this civilization. Like the level of like complicity and like their ability to like interact with like the civilizations around them is like immaculate. Like we don't talk about that. Like it's forgotten. We don't like consider that. I feel like when we talk about like ancient history. I feel like we only talk about North Africa like ever when Africa comes up.
Nevunda. But after traveling via Brazil and Spain, he died just 2 days after arriving in Rome. This kingdom also built cities larger than some in Europe, and many of their rulers became Christian very early on and adopted European fashions. Congolese men also joined Christian religious orders, they had their own coats of arms, and the kingdom survived in one form or another until the 19th century. So you had an almost European Christian kingdom in Central Africa, which had connections with the papacy and a large urban population. But their country was often torn apart by civil war, and strangely during one of these wars in the late 1600s, a prophet emerged. This prophet was Kimpa Vita, and she had visions claiming that Jesus was in fact born in the Congo. So it was sort of like an African version of Mormonism. Otherwise, in Central Africa you had many kingdoms, like the kingdoms of Burundi and Rwanda, which were established there in the late 1600s. From very early on, these kingdoms were based on Tutsi dominance over the Hutus, and this power dynamic would still be very important in the 20th century, leading to genocides in the respective countries and the outbreak of the First Congo War. In southern Africa, it was also the Bantu, specifically the Shona people, who built Great Zimbabwe in medieval times. But by the 1600s, Great Zimbabwe had fallen, and power in the region was transferred to Mutapa in Mozambique. This kingdom of Mutapa, however, was eventually weakened due to infighting and Portuguese interference. So by the late 17th century, they often accepted the vassalage of the Portuguese, or even their other new neighbour, the Rosvi Empire. The Rosvi grew rich on gold and were a formidable power, so they were able to fight back numerous Portuguese attempts to take over their gold mines. Going further north along the coast, and the Muslims once ruled over the important trading centres of Zanzibar and Mombasa, but their Kilwa Sultanate was already on the decline when the Portuguese arrived, and it ultimately collapsed. This allowed the Portuguese to take over these trading centres, but soon a new power emerged in the region, and anyone who has played Victoria 2 will know this power, Oman. Their capital of Muscat had been held by the Portuguese, but they were driven out of there in the 1600s, and the new Yoruba dynasty capitalized on their victory and chased the Portuguese west and took over the east coast of Africa. Zanzibar in particular would become an important trading centre for the lucrative Arab slave trade, something that played a very important role during the scramble for Africa centuries later. Plus, it was from Zanzibar that many Arab slavers would form trading centres deep into the interior of Africa.
We're going to note
Further north still, you had more Muslim sultanates in Somalia, like Ajuran, who fought back a couple Portuguese invasions. While nearby, the Adal Sultanate in the 1500s tried to conquer their Christian neighbours, the Ethiopians, but the Portuguese came to the aid of the Ethiopians and prevented the takeover from happening. The Ottomans, on the other hand, would come to the aid of the Muslims, starting the Ottoman-Portuguese War, which spread from East Africa all the way over to India. Now, in previous centuries, the Somalians were pretty intrepid explorers, as people like Said of Mogadishu made his way over to China in the 1300s. By now, though, they began to fall behind Europeans in terms of maritime technology and trade, but the port of Berbera continued to be incredibly important well into the 19th century. It was said during this time that thousands of camels would arrive at the port, bringing ivory, cattle, hides and the likes, ready to be shipped across Arabia and beyond. But their failures against Ethiopia meant that Ethiopia would remain an independent Christian kingdom trapped behind Muslim lands. So many Christians believed that this was the homeland of Prester John, a fictional Christian king of great wealth who would aid the Europeans in their conquest of the Islamic empires. Plus, this idea of Prester John encouraged many Europeans to explore the region. Furthermore, as a Christian kingdom, Ethiopia, like the Congo, had connections with Europe and the papacy. For instance, they sent ambassadors to the Council of Florence in the 1430s, and they even tried to form an alliance with the King of Aragon against the Muslims before that. Going even further back, their ruler, Lalibela, built huge stone churches which bear his name in the 12th century, as a sort of second Jerusalem. This came shortly after the Muslims reconquered the city of Jerusalem, so they were present in the Middle East during the Crusades, and Ethiopians, along with their Christian neighbours to the north, were sometimes present in the courts of the Byzantine Empire. Yet this whole area of East Africa, as you would expect, had a completely different racial makeup. Its position on the Indian Ocean brought in a number of Arab merchants who brought Islam to the area. Then, within Ethiopia, they had a number of different ethnicities, like the Tigrayans and the Amharans. Amharic was the language of the empire for the most part, but this was a Semitic language, closer to those in the Middle East rather than anything in Africa. Plus, in future centuries, many of the Ethiopian rulers and elites, just like many of the Europeans, would consider the Ethiopians to be Caucasian. For instance, a journalist from Haiti named Benito Sylvain met Emperor Menelik II in the 19th century, and he hoped that he would become an honorary president of their society, advancing the cause of black people. But Menelik refused, declaring that he was in fact a Caucasian man. But don't think of Caucasian as just being white like in the USA today, as at that time it included everyone from India to England. Then, in Ethiopia and even the Islamic Sultanates in the 1500s, they were facing a sort of migration crisis, as the Oromo people from southern Ethiopia began to migrate north. These Oromo people and the ruling Amharic never fully unified into a single entity, and conflicts between them continue to this day. The Ethiopians weren't even the only Christian kingdom in the region, as just to the north of them you had the Medri Bari, who survived for centuries. But just to the west of them you had more Islamic kingdoms and empires, like Darfur, Wadai and Bornu. Now for Bornu, they were in medieval times a far more powerful empire, but by this point they had become a bit of a rump state laying in modern-day Chad. Going further west still, you had the Hausa states, formed by the largest ethnic group within Africa, the Hausa. Then to the west of them, you had the declining Mali Empire. This empire, like others along the Sahara, grew rich from the trans-Saharan trade. Gold, salt, slaves and the likes passed through these great states, and once upon a time, the ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, was argued to be the richest man who ever lived. The salt mines here kept food preserved on long journeys, and whole salt mining towns were reliant on this trade to bring them food in the middle of the desert. And just to the south of them they had many gold mines, and I often think that the slave trade somewhat overshadows the West African gold trade. The desire for gold was not just among a few rich Europeans looking to get even richer, but at the beginning of the Age of Exploration, it was essential for the survival of the European economies. This is because from 1457 to 1464 there was a bullion famine, and the Europeans were running out of gold and silver. This was in part caused by wars like the 100 Years' War and the huge trade deficit the Europeans had with Asia. So Europeans began exploring and discovered West Africa and their gold mines, and these practically saved Europe. The gold in this region was so well circulated in Europe that this is where you get the name of the old Guinea coins from, because where else but Guinea could you get such a large quantity of gold? As such, there were numerous African states that popped up along the coast here. Benin and Oyo, for instance, had been around since medieval times, while others like Dahomey and Ashanti came about around 16 to 1700. But there's almost too many to mention in this summary. In the far reaches of West Africa around modern-day Senegal, there was the powerful Jolof Empire. But by the middle of the 16th century, Kayor broke free and the empire disintegrated into various states. However, as the Europeans began to enter West Africa, stories began to emerge of previous settlers in the region. For instance, in the 1600s, the French claimed that they had evidence of the Normans raiding the West African coast back in the 1300s. This was based on documents which have now disappeared and the alleged testimony of an 130-year-old Guinea man. He apparently mentioned a French battery in the region, but without those original documents, it's impossible to know if this was based on any truth. Another story came from the Genoese, who had their own explorers in medieval times and the early modern period. The most well-known was of course Columbus, but there was also the Vivaldi brothers, who tried to circumnavigate Africa way back in the 13th century.
So we're starting to get into the point where like European influence is really starting to get come around. And we saw over here that some Portuguese influence was going on. But the number one thing that I think, especially as Americans, that we don't fully understand is like he's not even touching on every single group of people, civilization, little kingdoms that popped up and came around. And even just the ones on the map, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like, 20. And like some of these kingdoms, like the richest man ever came from one of these. The so much gold was extracted that it economically saved Europe. The salt that was coming from those mines like was preserving food all across the world. And what it's about to play into in this like framework that it kind of laid out is going to get so abused to hold up these colonizing countries. It's going to be insane. But right now what we need to realize is how many of these civilizations, there is war and infighting 100%, like nothing's without conflict, but they're left to decide their own fate. Right now you see empires spouting up, economies coming to light, they're trading, they're sending ambassadors to Rome. This is like a complex like civilization on par with anything that was going on in Europe or anywhere else in the world. And I think, and one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that before we move any further is because, like, when I think as like Western history, American, we love to act like things like there was nothing going on before we got there. I often ponder on the facts, like when we were watching that Milo video a little while ago, talking about like the Native American earthworks that like take over Ohio and are massive and are 60, 80 miles long, throughout like central Ohio, that are connecting two giant river systems that would essentially connect you from New York to New Mexico. How complex, and like what we really destroyed. Like what we destroyed was an opportunity of like evolution. Like if we would have found more hospitable terms of survival and trade, like, you know, and they were able to stand on their own and, like, you know, forge their own path, and like the fact that one group was able to out tech them or just out brutalize them, and it just destroyed like lineages and like momentum that was carrying on since like human history had begun. Like they had more momentum, and they were building up towards something for much longer than any European nation. So like if Africa was like left on their own, like, you know, it's always interesting what it would look like today, because he's about to start introducing some global persuasion that to this day has toxic influences throughout Africa.
They, however, disappeared en route, but Antoniotto Usodomari, a later explorer writing over 150 years later, claimed to have found their descendants. Now, Usodomari was an early traveller in Africa, hoping to gain funding for future expeditions. So his reports are often filled with exaggerations and lies. For instance, he wrote of the incredibly rich lands of Prester John along the Gambia River, and, weirdly, a group of people speaking the Genoese dialect. So, apparently, the great-great-grandchildren of the Vivaldi brothers. Now, these medieval explorers may not have made it to West Africa, but ancient people did. The Phoenicians, for instance, explored the area, and Hanno the Navigator even tried to enslave gorillas way back in the 5th century BC. But even though successful trade stopped in medieval
Alexander
times,
the Great, baby.
that's not to say that Europe was completely cut off from West Africa.
Macedonia.
Obviously, the gold found its way from West Africa to Europe, but some strange items might have travelled the other way. Like in the 19th century, the British took over Ashanti and discovered a ewer dating back to the 1300s. It was inscribed with the English royal seal of the time and had English writing along the side. So it was clearly made in Plantagenet, England. But how it arrived there remains a mystery. Did it come with slave traders later on in the 18th century, or did it embark on a great medieval journey, being traded with people from Spain, Morocco, Mali and the likes, before finding its new home in the Ashanti Kingdom? It's really hard to know. Now, back in West Africa, there was a powerful empire just to the east of Senegal, the Songhai Empire. They had largely drove the Mali Empire into decline and took the city of Timbuktu from them. But the Songhai Empire had all but collapsed by the 1600s, and their defeat didn't come at the hands of the Europeans, but Morocco. The Moroccans of northern Africa in 1578 had fought back a Portuguese invasion, and their new sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, launched an invasion south and crushed the Songhai. The Moroccans at this point were so powerful that they were seen as a potential ally for the Tudor dynasty, and even the French, who hoped to fight against their mutual enemy of Spain. Plus, the Moroccans were so convinced that they could defeat the Spanish that al-Mansur planned on how to divide up the Spanish colonies in the Americas. However, their rule over West Africa didn't last long. The logistics of maintaining such a large empire across the Sahara proved to be too hard, especially after plague swept through the region, killing al-Mansur and weakening the kingdom. So they retreated back north just a couple decades later. And this brings me to one of the most forgotten colonizers of Africa, the Muslims of the north. After the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks in the early 1500s, they annexed Egypt, and this in turn opened their path to taking coastal Libya, Algeria and Tunisia. And this in turn opened up their path to taking coastal Libya, Algeria and Tunisia. These would later become the Barbary States, which infamously would launch pirate attacks on ships passing through the Mediterranean Sea. And if any nation wanted safe passage, they'd have to pay the respective countries tribute. Many Europeans would join the ranks of these pirates, notably Yan Soon, a Dutch pirate who wanted to attack their Spanish enemy. Under his command, the pirates would launch raids as far north as Iceland, where they captured hundreds of people in the 1620s. These people, like many Europeans at that time, were then brought back to the Barbary States and sold as slaves. Now, this slave trade at its height from around 1580 to 1680 probably saw close to 1 million Europeans enslaved and brought to North African states. But if you were to add this number to the number of Christians enslaved by the Ottomans to fill in the ranks of the Janissaries and the likes, the number would of course be a lot higher. Also, during this period, the pirates temporarily took over the English island of Lundy near Bristol, while back in Morocco, they formed their own republic, the Republic of Salih. Among the population of this republic, there were many Christian converts to Islam like Yan Yan Soon, plus there were many Muslims who were forcibly evicted from Spain in the decades prior, and also a collection of Jewish pirates who also wanted some revenge against the Spanish for kicking them out of their home. The Ottomans and the Muslim pirates were therefore the most dominant force in North Africa, but the Ottomans also began looking further south for land and expanded along the Red Sea. For instance, back in 1557, they seized Massawa in modern-day Eritrea, and it was from there that they got involved in the war between Adal, the Ethiopians, and the Portuguese. Plus, in North Africa, there were also a number of European colonies. The Portuguese tried numerous times to invade Morocco, and were sometimes successful in establishing bases along the coast. Most of these were reclaimed by the Moroccans, but there is one interesting tale in there. When Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, married King Charles II of England in 1662, she gave Tangier to the English as part of the dowry. This dowry also included Bombay, which set British expansion in India in motion. So the same thing could have happened in Tangier, with English expanding into North Africa. But the English Protestants already suspected that Charles was a Catholic, and there was a large number of Catholics garrisoning the town, so they later had the fortifications destroyed and left Morocco. Also, back in the 1500s...
It's crazy to think that, like, back in the day, land was just given to, like, one royal to another, and all of a sudden, like, decades of, like, colonization and, like, extractive capitalism, like, followed. Like, just because, like, we signed some piece of papers and we got married and I have to give you X amount of money for my hand in marriage or what the fuck ever their traditions are. Some, like, Western personal, like, you know, it wasn't really personal, it was business, let's be honest, but, like, some, like, paperwork and, like, way of life happening in one sector of the world, like, changes the course of history somewhere else for the next, like, 80 to 100 years. And, like,
the Spanish were able
they were
to
so close to doing the same thing to Morocco, what they did to India. I mean, it's just like the little decisions that actually, like, play an impact on, like, how the world changes and, like, how the world changes and how the world unfolds and how the story goes is just something that, again, I don't think we think about or consider enough.
Over quite a lot of important towns along the North African coast. For instance, they took over Tripoli in 1510 and gave it to the Knights of St. John in Malta. Algiers was also temporarily occupied by them, and Tunis was made a Spanish puppet, and so too was Jerba. They lost most of these to the Ottomans later on. However, to this day, the Spanish still hold on to some of their North African possessions, Melilla and Ceuta. So you had the Portuguese, Spanish, and English in North Africa.
And, like, you look at where those are, and it's clear to know why. You control that little piece of, you know, you have that economic control into the waters. That's how it goes. Like, from the shores you control, you have, like, you know, 50 nautical miles of control for, like, economic trade to impose, like, tariffs or taxes or what the fuck ever. And, look, of course they're going to make sure they own both sides of that strait. Of course. That means that anything going or coming to the Mediterranean Sea is controlled by the Spanish.
Melilla and Ceuta. So you had the Portuguese, Spanish, and English in North Africa.
Whoever.
Plus there was a very small French attempt as well, as they set up a fort called the Bastion of France in Annaba. There they hoped, like many, to exploit the coral trade in the region, but very little came from this colony. The largest coral traders at that time were the Italian Genoese, who held Tabarka in modern-day Tunisia all the way until the 18th century. However, European, or at least Christian, attempts to take over North Africa go back centuries. For instance, way back in the 12th century, the city of Pisa attacked Annaba. while the Sicilians held on to Gerba sporadically from the 12th to the 15th centuries. In fact, when the Normans ruled Sicily, they launched the Madia campaigns in the 11th century and took over large sections of Libya, Tunisia and Algeria. They controlled so much land that the Norman rulers took the title of the King of Africa and ruled over the area until the Almohad Caliphate kicked them out. Anyway, as Europeans began to grow more in wealth, they too looked to create their own colonial empires, and most of them arrived on the west coast. After all, this place was rich in gold, and many of them were looking to get involved in the growing slave market. In particular, the Gold Coast, or modern-day Ghana, saw a great number of Europeans arrive. But these Europeans, like in other regions, were not controlled by the governments of each country, but they were rather private trading companies. So just like the Virginia Company in America, or the numerous East India Companies, there was also groups like the English African Company of Merchants, or the Guinea Company. So
Again, just shell companies that are doing the bidding of politicians and political elites.
in West Africa, there were of course the English and the Dutch, who were by this point setting up colonies around the world. But there were also Danish and Swedish colonies, plus a short-lived Prussian attempt which lasted from 1682 to 1721. But possibly the most obscure colonial power was Courland. This was a small vassal state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth located in modern-day Latvia, but the population was a mix of local Baltic people, Polish and many Germans, who had arrived there during the Northern Crusades. They set up a colony on the Gold Coast from 1651 to 1661, however they also had a colony over in Senegal and had a Caribbean colony on the island of Tobago. So the language of many African countries could well have been German or even Swedish had things gone differently. But again, although this is a gross oversimplification, many of these countries would become distracted or indebted due to wars in Europe, and many of them would go on to sell their colonies to the Dutch or English. On the other hand, the Danes held on to colonies in West Africa and the Caribbean until the middle of the 19th century, but since the abolition of slavery, many of their settlements were abandoned and eventually sold off. Then, as we move into the late 17th century, the Dutch were on the decline, and in their place, the French appeared as a power in the colonial game. For instance, they seized Gorée from the Dutch. This island, by the way, has a bit of a controversial history, as it is often claimed to be one of the major hubs of the transatlantic slave trade, but this has been disputed in recent years. Now, this is because less than 5% of the 12 million slaves who crossed the Atlantic are said to have set off from the Senegambia region. Then even a smaller percent of them would have arrived at Gorée. So compared to other regions, this 5% is pretty low. The Gold Coast, for instance, sent over 10% of the slaves, the Bight of Benin over 20%, and by far, the largest number arrived from the area around Congo and Angola,
That's crazy.
with close to 40%. This, by the way, makes quite a bit of sense, as this is the region in which the Portuguese largely operated, and most slaves were not sent to the Caribbean or the United States, but in fact
South
Brazil.
American.
Close to 5 million arrived in Brazil, compared to 2 million in the British Caribbean, 1 million in the French Caribbean and Spanish Americas, and 500,000 in the Dutch Americas and modern-day United States respectively. Plus, it should also be said that over 1 million of those who left Africa never made it across the Atlantic at all. But now we're entering the slave trade, and this is another thing that seems to be completely misunderstood by many. On the one hand, it is said...
So we have a question here. Let's see what this is. I think we should be able to answer it now, but I don't think we got the answer. How did the slave trade weaken African kingdoms before colonization even started? Let's see what he has to say about that, but it feels like colonization has already started. How did slave trade weaken African kingdoms before colonization even started?
that Europeans were going out...
The next question is, where did the wealth from slave labor go? Built American South, enriched European trades, funded industrial
between the slaves themselves, while on the other, it is often said that the Africans were the biggest traders of slaves. But in truth, the situation was far more complicated, as you would expect. To try and simplify the situation, the slave trade was of course around long before the Europeans arrived. Muslim traders had been taking slaves across the Sahara, or the more regular route for slaves was via ports like Zanzibar. There were in fact so many African slaves in the Muslim world that there were huge slave rebellions. For instance, there was the Zanj rebellion in 9th century Iraq, which allegedly saw hundreds of thousands of men involved. The Islamic slave trade in Africa continued way until the 20th century, and in some cases like modern-day Libya or Mauritania, well into the 21st century. Plus, this slave trade would be a major justification for the Europeans to begin taking colonies in Africa. But I'll get onto that in later videos. And as a bit of a side note, although not Islamic, the Ethiopian slave trade would be used as a justification by Mussolini to invade the country in the 1930s. But anyway, onto the European slave trade. Now, some African kingdoms did engage in the trade, but not all of them. Other nations were completely torn apart by it, as their neighbours fought more aggressive campaigns against them, solely to capture slaves to sell to the Europeans or to keep to themselves. While, on the reverse, some nations and people flourished due to the slave trade. The Oyo Empire, for instance, launched campaigns to capture slaves, and sometimes even campaigns of conquest. They would also demand tribute from conquered people in the form of slaves, which they, in turn, sold to buy European guns, and the cycle continued. Nearby, Dahomey also had a largely slave-based economy. In the 18th century, the King of Dahomey even sent a diplomatic mission to Brazil, hoping to encourage further trade. And they were also one of the first nations to recognize Brazilian independence on that basis. But because it was forced to give male slaves to Oyo as tribute every year,
of course you're your own country. I would love to keep selling you human beings across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, we will recognize you as one of your own, as your own sovereign nation. We would love to make blood money off you. Some things will never change, huh?
To create an all-female military unit, named the Dahomey Amazons. These Amazons would often go on slave raids themselves, and during some festivities, hold mock battles showing them capturing male slaves. These female soldiers actually continued to be a powerful force in West Africa until the 19th century, and were present in the war against the French. Further east, some Aro people moved towards the coast, and set up their own confederacy in order to take advantage of the slave trade. While down south in Angola, there were the Imbangala, who would later form the Kasanji Kingdom, but they were initially marauders and mercenaries. They would attack settlements, capture slaves, and, according to some accounts, fill their ranks with captured kids. Plus, there are reports of them cannibalizing their victims, and forcing their new recruits to eat human meat. They therefore provided a far better slave trading partner for the Portuguese, rather than the nearby Kingdom of Congo. This is because the Congolese would often try to limit the number of slaves that the Portuguese exported, sometimes try to cut off trade altogether, and they even gave refuge to runaway slaves. So some nations were keen traders while others were not. Plus, like with the Islamic trade in East Africa, the transatlantic slave trade made some people incredibly rich, and allowed some kingdoms to flourish. But it mainly created a state of lawlessness, as warfare was near constant. Agriculture suffered as fields were left destroyed, and many young people of working or fighting age were taken from their homes to be sent to nearby kingdoms, or over to the Middle East or the Americas. There was, however, one other major hub for slaves that I've not mentioned, and that's Madagascar, where over 5% of slaves in the Americas came from. But on Madagascar,
over how many?
Homes to be sent to nearby kingdoms, or over to the Middle East or the Americas. There was, however, one other major hub for slaves that I've not mentioned, and that's Madagascar,
I thought Madagascar
where
was
over 5% of slaves in the Americas came from. But on Madagascar, the population there was completely different to the rest of Africa. Obviously, they were divided by the sea, but the original settlers didn't come from Africa at all. They came from Southeast Asia and were ethnically Austronesian. This means they had more in common with the Maori of New Zealand or the Hawaiians, rather than the Kenyans and the Nigerians. They first came from across the
Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that like how genetic code started here in Africa, somewhere in like here, right? Ethiopia. You know, it went up here, became European, went this way, became Asian, sailed the seas. And this population that started so close to here is more linked to like that genetic, you know, you start here, this is your genetic grandfather, right? So, like this becomes the father, another father, you know, these two are brothers, Asia and Europe. And then one of them brothers in Asia, that part of the genetic code created this like subset that likes to, you know, go across oceans, and then they populated something that's even closer to grandfather. It's just like, what the heck? when you follow like the genetic code and how it spread across the globe and how it evolved, it's pretty fucking crazy.
Indian Ocean around 500 AD, but soon afterwards, Muslim traders also began arriving, bringing their religion with them. Then, allegedly, more Austronesians crossed the Indian Ocean a couple centuries later, followed in the 9th century by the Bantus who came from mainland Africa. The English, French and Portuguese all tried to set up colonies on the island, but disease and pretty fierce locals meant they didn't survive longer than a couple of decades. But the French were able to establish bases on nearby islands like Reunion and Mauritius in the middle of the 1600s. As for the locals, they set up the Marina Kingdom. This kingdom would expand to take over most of the island, until the 19th century, when they were conquered by the French. But due to the numerous races that lived on the island, they would organize their society into a caste system of sorts. At the top were the Marina people, the Highlanders. They were known as the Andriana, and as you'd expect, they filled the positions of power, and were seen as more Austronesian in appearance. Below them were other people who spoke the local language of Malagasy, but were absorbed into the kingdom later on. These were called the Hova, and were the free commoners, while below them were the Andivo, slaves which were brought into the country in large numbers to work on the plantations. They were bought from the French and Arabs primarily, who brought them from Mozambique and the East African coast.
Man, like slavery is
so
like
similar
just
to the United States, it was quite a racially.
I mean, it is OP'd because like back in this time, the only way to ever make something is like with your hands and like human energy and force, right? So I guess like having slave is like the ultimate cheat code because then that slave can put their energy into creating value while you just like extract that value. But it's crazy like how widespread, like you know what I mean? Like it's like that's why I wanted to start here is because like Africa is both in resources like mineral resources, you know, gold, cotton, rubber, all those things, but also like a labor resource. Like it literally built the empires of the world. Like you know, we're gonna have to get into that Arab slave trade and see like where that led. But there's a chance the Arab slave trade like would lead into Asia, and that means that like Africa would have Africans would have been slaves that were sent to like all across the globe, Latin America, North America, South America, North America, Asia, and Europe. Like, what the heck? You even had like some pre-Russians coming in here. You know what I mean? That's wild.
Based form of slavery, and according to a recent UN report, there is still a large amount of discrimination against the slave caste. Meanwhile, there were allegedly stranger colonies set up on Madagascar by pirates. Although piracy is far more famous over in the Caribbean, many pirates in the 17th century began to terrorize the Indian Ocean. Captain Kidd, for instance, turned pirate after being tasked with trying to catch pirates off the coast of Madagascar, which was a great place for looting the treasures being brought back from India. One of the pirates who made a name for himself was Henry Every. He captured a ship belonging to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, and this led to possibly the world's first ever manhunt. Pirates like Adam Baldridge set up bases around Madagascar, like on the island of St. Mary's, plus there was a somewhat mythical colony called Libertatia, where pirates would go to war against oppressors and defend people's rights. However, many historians question whether or not it really existed. As we enter the 18th century, there wasn't really a great...
The crazy thing about being pirates and stuff off Madagascar at this time, and like running that type of naval fleet, is like the global trade went like underneath South America and had to come through here. I'm pretty sure this is before the Suez Canal was dug, so you couldn't go this way. You had to go, like, you know, go boat, and then go to land, and then travel across land, and then leave again, like to get through the Mediterranean. So a lot of it was still like economically more profitable, I believe, to go under Africa. So like this is like just a hub. Like no wonder the first manhunt happened here. This is like all the opportunity in the world to steal the world's riches are coming off of being a pirate coming off of Madagascar. I knew none of that about Madagascar. Like I love history, and for whatever reason I thought Madagascar was like an uninhabited jungle land. Like I didn't realize there was a whole ass empire that was running pirates off of running a potentially liberal pirate group that went around and fought the people who were oppressing other people. I mean, that's wild. History wild, bro.
Great deal of change in terms of colonization. For instance, during the 7 Years' War, the British took French posts in Senegal.
What's going on, Trump?
The French shortly afterwards. Most colonial efforts at this time were still focused on the Americas, which was far easier to settle in, or over in India, home to great rich.
Sorry, I missed that a little bit.
7 Years' War, the British took French posts in Senegal, but they were given back to the French shortly afterwards. Most colonial efforts at this time were still focused on the Americas, which was far easier to settle in, or over in India, home to great riches and cities. But Spain did enter Africa as they agreed to hand the Portuguese land in South America in return for Spanish Guinea, modern-day Equatorial Guinea, but Spanish influence in Africa below the Sahara will largely just keep to this area. In the south, the Dutch settlers began to form their own unique culture, and these Boers, or Afrikaners, began to launch treks into the interior of South Africa. Over in London, the African Association was set up in the last years of the century, aimed at exploring the continent further. They sent Mungo Park to Timbuktu, but by then it was a shadow of its former self. Ever since the Moroccan invasions, the city had been left weakened, and it had been invaded by Tuareg tribes a couple of times.
We're gonna have to do, because we're really just trying to get to like what how Africa built the economies pre-World War II, like how colonialism and the resources of labor and rare earth minerals were being extracted from Africa and created those economies. But we're gonna have to look into the history of Timbuktu, because I'm always fascinated about how these pillars of society in one era are just left to crumble in the next. Even with Rome, how come Rome might be, I know more of it, but why did it just crumble? Why did the influence leave it? And same with Timbuktu, I have no idea why Timbuktu would have fallen apart after. It sounds like Morocco invaded, but we're gonna have to maybe dive into that sometime.
Plus, the increase in transatlantic slave trade meant that it had lost its strategic importance as a trading centre, as money began to move further towards the coast. This was a pretty recurring theme across the continent, as the 18th century saw the demise of many once powerful nations. The Kingdom of Congo, for instance, was stuck in a near-endless fight for the throne, while over in Ethiopia, there was the Age of Princes, when the country was divided between various lords and the emperor had no real power. This in turn led to various ethnic clashes and, ultimately, the weakening of the empire. To the north of them, the old Christian Nubian states of Makuria had been defeated, but the new Muslim states of Darfur, Wadai and Funj fought a number of wars against each other during the 18th century. Plus, they also faced droughts which lasted for years, the power of the monarchs began to erode, and Ethiopian raids plundered a great deal of wealth. So by the beginning of the 19th century, the palace of Sennar in the Funj Sultanate was essentially in ruin. Yet there was one peculiar state stuck among the Christians and Muslims in this area, the Shilluk Kingdom. Here their religion was based around their kings, and their capital was Fashoda, a place that would gain a great deal of fame during the scramble for Africa. In the southeast, the Kingdom of Mutapa faced numerous civil wars, and competing factions constantly called on the Portuguese for aid. The Portuguese were obviously willing to participate, and the kingdom just disintegrated in that century. But on the Portuguese, they were able to expand their holdings in Africa at the expense of kingdoms like Congo. However, Portugal itself was weakening, so they had very little direct rule over much of the land they took over. Otherwise, the Portuguese also aided in the rise of the Zulu kingdom in nearby South Africa. This is because they brought maize over from the Americas, and it had spread inland by the middle of the 18th century. This led to a huge increase in population in the region and spurred on the desire to seize arable land, which had dramatically increased in importance due to the crop. So the Zulu, along with other Bantu people, began to set up their own kingdoms in the decades following this. Over in the west of Africa, a number of palace coups weakened the Oyo Empire, and there was also the fall of the Great Falu Empire to an altogether new threat, jihadists. These jihads began in the 1720s and were largely launched by the Fula people, who today can be found in nearly every West African country. They were inspired to launch jihads by the Turodbi, a group of clerics whose origins are not altogether that clear. They had in fact begun to launch jihads at the end of the 17th century, but they really became significant in the 18th, starting with Karamoko Alpha's conquest of Futa Jalan. They destroyed many sacred animist objects belonging to the locals, including a ceremonial drum, and made a great deal of money from selling the slaves onto the Europeans. But, just like the Christians in Europe, they refused to sell Muslim slaves. and even banned the French from using the rivers in their kingdoms for transporting Muslim slaves. Their success in turn led to further jihadist states being formed across West Africa, like Futa Toro, which was founded in 1776 at the expense of the Great Fulo Empire. Then, in the early 19th century, they took over Timbuktu and formed the Messina Empire. But their greatest state was probably the Sokoto Caliphate. This caliphate conquered the Hausa kingdoms and drove back the Bornu Empire, which was also largely Islamic. And this Sokoto Caliphate ruled over the region until the very early 20th century. Plus, in the north, the 18th century was also a bit of a disaster for the Moroccans. Meanwhile, up in the north, the Moroccans, the people that once tried to create a huge West African empire, were also on the decline. Under Ismail ibn Sharif, the country's various tribes and ethnicities were brought under central control in the late 17th century, and he even managed to retake many Spanish towns in the region, like Madilla and Asila. Then, to further weaken the Europeans, he sponsored pirate attacks against them, but the various divisions were never fully bridged. This is evidenced by the creation of the Black Guard, a personal guard made up entirely of sub-Saharan African slaves. They were seen as more loyal than any of the various people in Morocco, and were tasked with collecting taxes, crushing rebellions and the likes. But when Ismail died in 1727, the country began to unravel and descend into anarchy for the following decades. Their neighbours to the east, the Ottomans, were also on the decline in the 18th century. Although their decline in Europe is more well known, they had been losing control of North Africa ever since the beginning of the 1700s. For instance, in
and I know we're far off of it, but it's interesting to note that the North African campaigns for World War II took place in like Morocco might have been a landing site. I can't remember if this is the landing site for the British, but I know the Germans and the British use this coastline, and they go back and forth this coastline, and I think even down into like this Ethiopian region, like back and forth like 2 or 3 times. So it's crazy to think that like the Ottoman Empire was losing control like before that timeline, and like that same infrastructure that they were controlling is what Hitler and the Allies were like fighting over for a good portion of the war.
Tripolitania, a janissary named Ahmed Karamanli murdered the Ottoman ruler of the region in 1711, and he took power for himself. Towards the end of the century, a Turkish officer named Ali Pasha tried to restore Ottoman control through a coup of his own. But the civil war of the 1790s saw the Karamanli dynasty re-establish their authority. The same thing happened in Tunis, with Al-Hussein ibn Ali, who took power in 1705, and in Algiers, where Baba Ali Chok ousted the Ottoman officials. Plus, on Algiers, they started demanding higher tributes from the European powers, and when this was refused, they actually started wars against them. So long before the Barbary Wars of the 19th century, Baba declared war on the Dutch in 1715, and then in 1769, the Danes declared war on Algiers. The Algerians responded by enslaving the crew on a number of Danish ships, and refused to surrender despite the threat of the city being bombarded. And, fortunately for them at least, many Danish soldiers died of typhoid during the conflict, meaning the Algerians defeated the Danes. The Spanish would then declare war in the 1770s to stop further Algerian raids. But despite having their cities heavily bombarded, the Algerians still refused to surrender, and a poorly planned Spanish assault on Algiers was driven back. So, once again, the Algerians were successful. But their luck would eventually run out in a couple of decades, when the Americans under Thomas Jefferson, and also the British, would defeat them. And just at the end of the century, further east still, Napoleon invaded Egypt. Although he was defeated and left the region, this set off a huge chain reaction, which completely changed the course of African history. This is because Egypt, although under Ottoman control, had been governed by the Mamluks for centuries. This was a military caste made up of slaves brought from the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the likes. So the ruling elite of Egypt was a different ethnicity to the larger Arab population. But now they'd been defeated by Napoleon, which resulted in a power vacuum. Eventually a man who may well have been Albanian took over. He was Muhammad Ali, and his dynasty would rule Egypt virtually independently of the Ottomans. But his dynasty would change the world. They created their own empire, built the Suez Canal, and fell into debt, which brought the British into the country, and this led to the Mahdist Wars. So I'll look at the very beginning.
The building of the Suez Canal traded global trade forever. Like this, right? I'm pretty sure this is it right here. It became how I was saying, like Madagascar was like a great place for piracy because like every trade route was coming down this way. Once that Suez Canal gets finished, that creates the pipeline for like it cuts it in half, like getting to like European consumers from like the raw materials to like the industrialization of Europe gets cut down by I think like, if I'm not mistaken, like a month or two. Like building that Suez Canal, and then Egypt becomes even more important because if you are in charge of Egypt, or at least like allies with Egypt, you have control of that Suez Canal, which Britain gets involved with the debt, and he's talking about a type of war that we should probably look into. I forget the name of it though.
Their own empire, built the Suez Canal, and fell into debt, which brought the British into the country, and this led to the Mahdist Wars. So I'll look at the very beginnings of the scramble in the next episode and leave it here for now. At the end of the 18th century, where we have a power vacuum in Egypt, declining powers in all parts of the continent, jihadist states in the west, slave trading kingdoms like Ashanti Dahomey in Madagascar, Arab rule in the east, and a collection of very small European colonies around the coast. But then, although often ignored, the Napoleonic Wars and its aftermath brought about a number of changes in Africa. Notably, the British entered South Africa, the Americans defeated the Barbary states, the British fought the Ashanti, and the government took direct control of the West African colonies. Then the restored French monarchy invaded Algeria, and probably most importantly, for many African kingdoms, slavery was abolished. This meant the kingdoms that emerged in the 17th and 18th century, those that built their economy on the slave trade, were left economically crippled, and this weakened the continent's major powers even further. Although the African continent had a number of powerful kingdoms in the early modern period, like Congo, Ethiopia, Mutapa, and Morocco, by the end of the 18th century, most of them had been left weakened by civil wars, foreign intervention, and constant warfare. Many of these wars were spurred on by the demand for slaves, but then the continent would completely change with the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, starting with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. At that time, Egypt was ruled by the Ottomans, but that was just another power on the decline in the 18th century, and by then the Barbary states of North Africa were acting independent of their rule. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Mamluks had largely ran the country for centuries. This was a military caste made up of slaves brought from the Caucasus, Balkans, and the likes. So the ruling elite of Egypt was a different ethnicity to the larger Arab population. This meant when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he largely fought the Mamluks and their armies, and despite some early victories, Royal Navy blockades and disease forced Napoleon to flee. But the defeats of the Mamluks had created a power vacuum in the country, as power was then fought over between the Mamluks, Turkish governor sent by the Ottomans, and Muhammad Ali, a leader of Albanian troops that the Ottomans sent to fight the French. During the following years of chaos, Muhammad Ali was successful in defeating the Mamluks, cementing his control, and even expanding Egypt's borders. His first war was against a new sect of Islam in Saudi Arabia, named the Wahhabis. After this war, he invited the remaining Mamluks to celebrate, but as they entered the city, they were massacred. Those who survived by remaining in the countryside fled south to Sudan, but Muhammad Ali pursued them in 1820. This began Egypt's conquest of Sudan. However, Muhammad Ali had another reason for the conquest. As he wrote, "You are aware that the end of all our effort and this expense is to procure Negroes." And in this he was successful. The kingdom of Funj and the surrounding area were conquered by only 10,000 men or so, demonstrating to the world how a small, well-trained force using modern weapons can defeat a whole kingdom. After this, the Egyptians would launch further campaigns of conquest, taking Kassala, Fashoda, Suakin, Equatoria, and Darfur by 1874. But one country they didn't conquer was Ethiopia. Meanwhile, Muhammad Ali's dynasty would fight wars against the Ottomans, and for a short while, they even took Syria. So they could be seen as the first true colonizers of Africa, who didn't just seek trading posts, but large stretches of land. Plus, even though his dynasty would remain officially under Ottoman control, they virtually acted independent, and Egypt under their rule would try to rapidly modernize. For instance, the Suez Canal would be built, which would bring European traders and colonizers into East Africa. However, the Egyptian wars and modernization plunged them into debt, and this led to the British entering the country, the Mahdist Wars, and a great deal more. But going back to the turn of the 19th century, there were a few changes that occurred during the Napoleonic Wars. For instance, the British took Mauritius from the French, but more importantly, there was the formation of the Zulu Kingdom, formed by Shaka Zulu, and Bantu people who migrated south. Simultaneously, the British took the Dutch colony in South Africa, pushing the Dutch Boers on their great trek in 1836 to establish their own states. This meant that there was a three-way power struggle between the Boers, the British, and the Zulu. However, these three powers obviously didn't just pop into being peacefully. They conquered and ruled over a number of different races. The British, for instance, went to war almost immediately against the Xhosa people. The first confrontation between them took place in the 1810s, when the Xhosa occupied the Zerveld region, which had acted as a buffer, but they were promptly driven out of it. There was another war that decade beginning in...
This had to be such a wild time. Because, like, you know, you live in Africa, and maybe, you know, I'm sure, like, there's families and people that knew peace and whatnot. But every time someone, like, pulled up on your shores, you just had to be ready to go to war. You know, because, I mean, at this point, like, you have to know the pattern that, like, so people show up on some boats, they start building a village, and then you start going to war, right? I mean, is that not, I mean, that feels like how, it, like, all these spots have, like, gone. Or you train them slaves. If you train them slaves, they won't go to war and kill your people. I mean, that feels like pretty much what's going on. And, you know, I'm not trying to, like, stick my nose up at anybody. But it feels like that's, like, what's happening. It feels like that's what's going on. Like, you know, if you knew that, like, people were about to pull up on you, you knew that, like, war was coming. Like, I feel like you'd be on ready. Like, no negotiation. Like, bro, this is my land. Like, we're going straight to fisticuffs. Because of, like, how the story's been going throughout the continent for an entire century, if not longer.
1818, which was largely led by a Xhosa prophet named Makana Mngxele. Now, he allegedly had the power to turn bullets into water and hoped to unite the Xhosa against the British, who had seized thousands of cattle belonging to them. But the British had the support of the San people, and together they defeated the Xhosa. As for Makana, he became the first person to be sentenced to prison on Robben Island, which became the infamous site of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment. In the intervening years, thousands of British settlers arrived in South Africa, while the Xhosa angered the Boers with their cattle raids. So TribeChief sent his Boer commandos on punitive expeditions against them, while the Sixth Xhosa War erupted in 1834. It was another speedy victory for the British, who took more land and even imprisoned King Hintsa. However, while negotiating the payment for stolen cattle, the king tried to escape and was killed in the chase. However, despite this victory, Britain's inability to protect Boer settlers convinced them to take matters into their own hands and thus embark on the Great Trek North. However, tensions between the British and the Boers had been running high for some time. Obviously, English became the official language, and British laws and culture alienated the Boers. But what possibly angered them the most was Britain's racial policies. For instance, back in 1815, the British declared the natives of South Africa would be citizens and share the same rights. The British then outlawed slavery in the region in 1834, freeing 30,000 or so African slaves. At that time, it is believed over 90% of Boers in some regions like Stellenbosch owned slaves, so this, along with British weakness during the Xhosa cattle raids, prompted the Boers to set off north and establish their own republics. These treks lasted a couple of years, and only around 6,000 people, or 1/5 of the Dutch population, made the journey, and they faced attacks from all sides. The Matabele, for instance, attacked them early on, but in 1836 at the Battle of Vekkop, just 35 Boers held off an attack from over 5,000 Matabele warriors. The following punitive attacks pushed the Matabele out of the region and into Zimbabwe, where most of them live today. But their arrival came at the cost of the Shona people, and tensions between these communities continue to this day. But probably the worst attacks came from the Zulu. For instance, in 1838, TribeChief met with Dingane, the Zulu king, to discuss a land treaty and watch a ceremonial performance. However, it was a trap, and 100 people, including Retief, were massacred. This was followed up with a number of other massacres like the Wenin massacre, in which over 500 Boers were killed. So the Boers could well have been destroyed and chased out of their new land. But the betrayal and massacres encouraged them to meet the Zulu at the Battle of Blood River in late 1838. In this battle they were victorious and they set up the Republic of Natalia, while the Zulus descended into civil wars, as the Boers, under Pretorius, helped Mpande remove his brother Dingane from power. But the Boers were not allowed to remain in Natalia for long, as the British moved troops in there in 1842 and forced them out. So other Boer republics were established, like at Klip River. Before, in the 1850s, the Orange Free State and Transvaal were established. But the Boers weren't the only people establishing new republics, as there was also the Griqua, a group of mixed-race people who set up their own republics, like Griqualand East and West in the 1860s, centered around mining areas. Then finally onto the Zulus, who probably launched the most destructive campaigns in the region. From around 1815 to 1840, the Zulus launched their wars of expansion, and this period has been called Umfekane by the original inhabitants. This word has many meanings, but think of it as meaning a scattering of people, as people were forced off their land, and it is estimated that over 1 million people were killed. People fled in every direction and established their own kingdoms and states. For instance, after the defeat of Undwandwe Shoshangani, he went to Mozambique and set up the Gaza Empire. The Fengu people, on the other hand, arrived in Kosaland, putting further strain on their resources, and if you look at a map of South Africa today, you will see a tiny nation trapped inside it. This is Lesotho. The origins of this country date back to this period, as Moshoeshoe I took his Sotho people into the mountains to escape the Zulu wars. The other tiny nation in this region is Swaziland, or Eswatini, which still has a monarchy, but their monarchy goes back to the middle of the 18th century. Beforehand, the Swazi were living around Delgoa Bay in Mozambique, but they settled in the area that they are today, under the leadership of Dlamini III, and they are quite unique in not being affected by the Zulu wars. To the east of them, the Portuguese still continue to rule Mozambique, but their power was largely on the wane by now, and a lot of trade along the east coast was now being conducted by the Omani people who ruled in Zanzibar. Yet, like the Griqua in South Africa, there was a collection of mixed-race people on their borders, who became incredibly influential in the region, often serving as intermediaries between the two groups of people. They, however, acted more like feudal lords, running large estates or prazos, which they were given in exchange for an annual fee. Their huge estates were protected by slave soldiers known as Chikundu, and some families owned a few thousand of them. Some of these families would also become somewhat Africanized, and even became chiefs of local tribes. In later decades, the Portuguese would try to bring them back under their control, especially after David Livingstone began exploring the region. But some of these families, like the De Cruz family, were able to drive them back in 1868. David Livingstone, by the way, was a Scottish missionary who, largely on his own accord, began exploring Africa in the middle of the century. From South Africa, he journeyed north and established a mission as far away as Blantyre in modern-day Malawi. From the 1840s to the 1860s, he traveled around Africa and made some...
It looks like he stayed away from those Zulu wars, huh? He's keeping distance.
pretty strange alliances in the process. For instance, the Makololo traveled with him from Zambia to Malawi, and they would later fight alongside the British. During it all, he reported all of his findings back to the Europeans, including the resources of the continent and the Arab massacres of Africans, plus the ongoing slave trade. But very few cared initially. He eventually disappeared in 1869, and Henry Morton Stanley was sent out to find him. They met on the shores of Lake Tanganyika in 1871 with the famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." On Stanley, he was also struggling to find funding for exploration, and he often depended on newspapers rather than his own government. Eventually, he relented and went to Leopold II of Belgium, the only European leader eager to colonize the area. But he would later be horrified to find out Leopold's intentions. Now, these might be two of the most famous explorers, but they were far from the first. The Scottish in particular had a number of explorers around Africa, like MacGregor Laird, who travelled along the Niger in the 1830s, and Alexander Gordon Laing, who travelled to Timbuktu back in the 1820s. The Irish-born Frenchman, Antoine Thomas de Abadie, explored Ethiopia in the 1830s, and Richard Francis Burton, a peculiar explorer, tried to find the source of the Nile. But Burton also went to Mecca dressed as a Muslim, gained the nickname Ruffian Dick for getting into fights, and collected measurements of people's penises wherever he went.
The fuck?
Yet he was probably inspired by a much earlier explorer, Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer who went on the Hajj, rediscovered incredibly famous sites like Petra and Abu Simbel in the 1820s, but ultimately was prevented from travelling beyond Egypt by the local authorities. There was also some German explorers like Heinrich Barth, who explored the Sahara and West Africa, and the Latvian-born German George August Schweinfurt, who explored Sudan. But once again, these were largely privately funded expeditions, led by botanists.
It's interesting that they were reliant on exploration and paying their own scouts to go see the area. When there was so many civilizations and groups of people living in this area, you would think that some common ground would be able to be shared, unless map making just wasn't a thing. But that just can't be factualized. Actually true. It's interesting that Europeans weren't able to use soft power and negotiation to get land discovered and for them to see things. It's interesting that they had to rely on scouts, which I'm sure is only partially true. I'm sure if you dove into how those relationships actually worked, there had to be some give and take. I can't imagine exploration. You just have to go make your own map without any help or guidance from local people. That can't be how that works.
Missionaries.
It can't be.
And they really didn't come from the colonial ambitions of any European government, at least before the 1870s. So British explorers were journeying out of South Africa, while they continued to fight against the Xhosa. These wars went until the 1870s, and one of the strangest episodes of these wars was the cattle-killing movement of the 1850s. This began when a 16-year-old prophetess claimed that she had spoken with the Xhosa ancestors, and they promised to aid them drive the Europeans into the sea. But they were only willing to help the living Xhosa if they destroyed all of their current means of substance. So they burnt down their own crops and killed thousands of cattle. Even the leaders began to demand people do it. But when the day of reckoning was supposed to come in 1858, obviously they were disappointed, and thousands died of starvation. Meanwhile, before the scramble, the British were fighting elsewhere in Africa. Going back to the beginning of the century, in the West, the British were getting involved in wars along the Gold Coast, because, just like in the Americas, Europeans would often align with different tribes or nations. There, the British often aided the Fanti Confederacy, while the Dutch, historically, helped the far more powerful Ashanti Kingdom. The Fanti, by the way, also flew Asafo flags in battle, something very similar to a regimental flag, many of which featured a Union Jack. So the British, albeit in a very minor way, got involved in the Ashanti-Fanti War of 1806. Then the Ashanti fought the Fanti again in 1811, and won again. But the Kingdom of Ashanti's most ambitious war of conquest came in 1814, when they conquered large sections of the Gold Coast with an army of 20,000 men, and threatened to remove the Europeans from the area. So in 1817, the British African Company of Merchants signed a treaty of friendship with them, recognizing their recent conquests. However, the British African Company of Merchants was soon dissolved in 1821, and the British government took control of the West African colonies. Shortly afterwards, in 1823, the Ashanti killed soldiers in the British Royal African Regiment, leading to the First Anglo-Ashanti War. During this war, the British were actually defeated in early battles, and their commander, Charles McCarthy, was killed and his skull was turned into a cup, and his heart was allegedly eaten.
So
but during that fatal battle, only 4 crates of supplies were brought to the front line, 3 of which only contained macaroni. Therefore, the 500 people in the British Army were doomed against the 10,000 Ashanti. So to counterattack, the British brought Congreve rockets into the region and drove the Ashanti back, securing a great deal of the Gold Coast, either directly under their control or under the control of their allies like the Fanti. Plus, it should also be said that the African Company of Merchants was also dissolved because they were still allegedly trading in slaves, something that was banned in 1807. This ban was taken incredibly seriously by the British, as they also created the West African Squadron, which patrolled the seas in the area, hoping to stop slave ships. To further help in this effort, they formed a new base in Banjul in 1816, and this would be the basis of the Gambia in the following decades. However, only 20 ships patrolled the entire West African coast, so maybe only 10% of ships were stopped crossing the Atlantic, and it's believed that thousands of slaves were just thrown overboard as the slavers didn't want to pay the fines to the British. Still, it is believed over 150,000 slaves were liberated in these decades and were brought back to Africa, while in Africa, this ban on slavery had major consequences. The powers that had emerged over the last couple hundred years had based their economies on the export of slaves, along with other items like...
It's weird to think about, but they kind of fell trap to they fell trap, and I mean, like, because slavery was what they built everything off of, that them making that illegal, making that something that would be punishable from the other kingdoms, actually led it to a resource curse. Wait, hold on, is that? Hold on. Is that what I'm thinking of? No. Is that it? It is. So that turned into a resource curse where they had like the paradox of having that resource, but since they while they were like prospering and they had funds, they didn't put money into creating another industry. It's the same thing we were saying like in that war, like when we were looking at like that between World War I and II, the nations that like became radicalized, the nations that started turning towards fascism and even like communism, were the ones that like weren't having industries invested in or having people or having their government and like the source of the wealth given back in some way, shape, or form to the people who needed it. And it's interesting that like almost like in a vacuum, without like the organizing of socialism and communism, it's interesting that like people will just almost naturally just like find themselves in that resource curse, whether they're forced into it or not. If it's an easy resource and they're not mindful of how they use their wealth once they get it to develop other industries, they're going to be stuck where one decision, legislative decision, one moral decision, or one variable outside of their control is going to wreck an entire kingdom's or nation's economy. These girls are badasses too, huh?
So the ban
It's like these are what the people from Wakanda were based off of. Some badasses.
In their states,
and I'm sorry
it was
about
met with outrage by many Africans.
Breaking this and talking as much. I've been trying to wait for him to get to the colonization. I thought it was going to happen earlier. I didn't realize it was going to happen this late. But I've been waiting to get to the scramble of Africa, because that's where like a lot of things really start like popping out about like capitalism, because capitalism had been around for. I mean, again, it started like the 1600s, but the scramble happened in like 1885, where like we'll learn about it here in a second. But during that scramble, that's when like a lot of like powers and like all of this is like planting seeds, but those seeds turn into roots and start bearing a little bit of fruit after the scramble of Africa happens. Because all we're talking about right now are African nations and trading posts being created. We haven't like gotten to the full colonization outside of what Muhammad Ali did in Egypt, which we should look into that because the story of Egypt is, because Egypt's like one of the first civilizations, so it plays an impact with like Mesopotamia, it plays part with like Rome, the Ottomans. Egypt has always been like a center piece of like travel and trade, like where Africa. Well, I mean, it makes sense because it's like where Africa and Asia start to meet, right? But and it's like with the Nile River is like one of the most fruitful rivers, I mean, in history. So, but again, this era of history, like from like where ancient medieval history starts to pitter patter to like World War II, some of like my weakest knowledge. I know again what American histories or classrooms have taught me in terms of like the American Revolution, 1776, where we're fighting the Civil War during some of this time. Like in the what was the American Civil War? It was like at the end of the 19th century, right? It was like 1860s? I'm looking it up real quick. Yeah, 1861 to 1865. It's crazy we didn't even make it 100 years before we went to war with each other. We were founded in 1776, and we were going to full-on civil war by 1885 or 1865, 1860, 1861, 1861. It's a crazy, crazy fact. We weren't even here for 100 years, and we were ready to go to war. But it was over the slavery stuff. Like the slaves trade that was happening here in Africa directly impacted directly impacted American history, and we'll have to get into it too, because again, Africa supplied the resources and the labor that built empires and nations and the global world powers of today. And I know we just saw that stat of like 500,000 slaves were sent to like, what is America today. There was like so many more slaves from Africa sent to like Brazil. And we'll have to get into it because I know that's true, but I think like total numbers of slave, but like our slave like domestic growth was insane because we essentially started like using like domestication practices that you use for like farm animals on like slaves, and we were like ripping family apart, and like we were making breeding farms, and I can't remember if it was on stream or not, but I was watching something about like one of the most profitable plantations you could own was like essentially a human plantation where you were like growing and training slaves to be sent across America. So we just took the evil. We might not have done the quantity, but our quality goes on forever and ever and ever in our evil endeavors. But again, we can look into that at some point if we get a chance. We're of course going to keep doing these history dives, but we're going to stay on track and keep following the economy from where we are right now into Africa into World War II, because again, we're trying to get into the ties with global, or with where we are currently with our modern government, and I think we're seeing a lot of it. Some of the roots already kind of transpiring here. Let's just wait, because I want to get to that Leopold guy. That Leopold guy, I have a video saved up on him. That brother was crazy.
And leaders, like the King of Bonny in Nigeria, who wrote to the British saying, "We think this trade must go on. They say that your country, however great, can never stop a trade ordained by God himself." Plus, the ban did little to stop the trade of slaves within Africa. The Igbo people, for instance, continued trading, while the Dahomey used slaves as a display of wealth and prestige. As King Gezo of Dahomey wrote in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." These kingdoms continue to find some markets to export to, primarily Brazil, which only abolished slavery in 1888. Plus, there was also still the option of selling to Islamic slave traders, while within Africa, Mauritania only abolished slavery in 1981, and they still had slaveholders in the 21st century. Otherwise, the abolition of slavery made colonies in Africa far less profitable. As mentioned before, this led to nations like Denmark selling their colonies in the 19th century. Then things became more complicated, as many of the slaves who were freed migrated to Nigeria beginning in the 1830s, where they were called the Saro people. Some of these people, as they migrated, were just enslaved again though, or they were used as some sort of political tool. For instance, the ruler of Lagos, a major slave trading port, was Oba Akitoye. He was willing to ban slavery across his state in order to secure British support. But this was of course unpopular among the slave owners and traders, so they rebelled and placed his brother Kosoko on the throne. In exile, he appealed to the British for help, and they obliged in 1851, on the assurance that he would ban the slave trade. A fleet was dispatched to Lagos, they bombarded the city, and installed Akitoye on the throne. But he died shortly afterwards, and there was another power struggle between his son, Dosunmu, and Kosoko. Then there was another problem for Britain. The French had been forming trade agreements with nearby rulers like Soji, the king of Porto Novo, who was obviously worried about British military action. The rulers of Lagos also flirted with the idea of accepting French protection, and this convinced Lord Palmerston to act before the French did. So in 1861, British ships arrived once again, and Lagos became a British protectorate, thus establishing a foothold in what would become Nigeria. This also put the British remarkably close to one of the oldest kingdoms in Africa, the Kingdom of Benin, which is most famous for their remarkably large capital city and the huge walls defending it. In fact, back in the 1600s, many European explorers said that the city was equal in size to some of their own cities back home. But large walls, or at least large gates, were not unique to Benin, as in the north the Hausa states like Kanu, Zazau and Katsina all had huge gates defending their palaces and cities. But back on the coast, the French and local African rulers were obviously angry by British expansion. While the British were supposed to be freeing slaves, they were simultaneously taking fresh colonies in Gambia and Nigeria. So in 1863, Sodji of Porto Novo signed an agreement with the French. But the French were not really better in this regard, as just nearby, back in the 1840s, they signed an agreement with the Nzema people of the Ivory Coast. This allowed them to set up a fort in Grand Bassam and expand their influence in the region. But going back to slavery, the British even began to bring freed slaves from across North America and even Europe to their main base in West Africa, Sierra Leone. This colony was home to the infamous Bunce Island, but even when slavery was legal, there was a huge scheme to resettle black people in this area. Many of these black people fought alongside the British in the American Revolution in exchange for their freedom, while others like Olaudah Equiano was able to purchase his freedom in the Caribbean. He, like many others, went to live in England and formed the Sons of Africa group, aimed at abolishing the slave trade. Meanwhile, white abolitionists set up the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor. They believed that sending the poor black people from Canada or the UK back to Africa would help relieve their poverty. But this plan also got support from many racists who hoped to remove black people from their countries. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger said they should be sent somewhere and be no longer suffered to infest the streets of London. So with government approval, former slaves from England and Nova Scotia were resettled in Sierra Leone, where they founded the city of Freetown. On arrival, they had many rights and even elected their officials, but they were given very few supplies, faced conflicts with their African neighbours, and back in 1799 they rebelled. To crush the rebellion, the British used Jamaican Maroons. Now these Maroons had escaped from slavery and lived in the countryside of Jamaica, but in the 1790s they also rebelled against the British. Many of them were deported to Canada, but on the outset of the rebellion in Sierra Leone, 500 of them were transported to Africa to crush the rebels. In return, they were given land and became part of the new social elite. So within this new society, there were Maroons, the Nova Scotians as they were called, liberated Africans the West African Squadron had taken from slave ships, and the local people. These groups would rarely get along. For instance, a Maroon leader named Major Jarrett was killed by his liberated African employee. This prompted attacks from both sides until many Maroons fled back across the Atlantic. But over time during the 19th century, these three immigrant groups would begin to merge together into the Creole people of Sierra Leone. They lived in homes that were clearly inspired by their old homes in southern USA, they developed their own language known as Creole, and they even began trading down the West African coast and settling in new countries. Then, just across their eastern border, the country of Liberia had a very similar origin tale. There, the American Colonization Society acquired land from the Gola ruler, named King Peter, in 1821. This land served as a base for the former slaves to arrive in, but from the beginning, they too faced attacks from the locals, specifically the Malinka people. But the liberated slaves in Liberia also had government support from President Monroe, and in his honor, they named their first town Monrovia. Only a few thousand people actually made the trip to Liberia, and of them, less than 2,000 were still alive by 1841, when Joseph Jenkins Roberts declared that the country was independent. However, the history of Liberia took quite a dark turn, as the Americo-Liberians began to emulate the slave owners of Southern America. So their society was based upon segregation, with them at the top.
I don't get it, man. How many times throughout human history have we seen that? Like, where something that was like a direct, supposed to be a solution of a direct moral problem, leaves that moral problem to go be a solution, and within no time at all, you just see that solution get turned back into the same problem that it was trying to escape. I mean, you can see that here, even in America. Like I mean, it might have been a little bit longer of time in this direct scenario, but we left to leave like authoritarian rule within a monarch, and now you have people here in America who are peasant brained and think that having a monarchy would be a better idea than having a democracy, which is just like a wild like turn of events. And I don't know what it is in the human condition that makes that always seem like a 50-50 chance. There's always a 50-50 chance that what's about to happen is about to be the same problem just repeating itself when you think you find a solution. Give me one quick second. I want to pull out the this right here. What did we get into? The Berlin conference is about to start, or 144. Holy shit. Ugh. I mean, it's a very like information-packed video, but it's just so dense. Here, should we jump? Does it take a better turn?
So the Berlin Conference was held in late 1884 to early 1885. Meanwhile, the British took over some little posts to counter German influence, like in Walvis Bay in Namibia. But this was all pretty inconsequential, as Bismarck was keen to host the conference to keep the peace and cement control over his new colonies. But he had just a few years earlier held the Congress.
Apologies. That was someone telling me I got like a 25-minute warning. So I apologize for that break right there. That's all me. So let's back up a little bit because that was a lot of just dense information. Let's back up a little bit because that was a lot of dense information. We got a lot of information about Africa. Talk about the different kingdoms that came and went. Some of the extraction that was happening at the time. How there was a British or European influence trying to set up trade posts and dominate the land and make money off things like the slave trade, off the the gold in West Africa saved European economies. How there was pirates off Madagascar that were messing up some global trade. And the first manhunt ever was because one of those pirates pissed off and took the wrong king shit vessels. A lot of infighting, of course. That I don't think that was a cohesive study of Africa. I think that was just like a good overview of things that have happened. If you really wanted to dive in, you'd probably have to dive in and do like an hour study on each decade that transpired to really get a proper understanding of all the intricacies of African history, especially ancient history. And we were leading up to, we left off with like the how American slaves were trying to return, and we were really getting to the Berlin Conference. So we're gonna hold off just for a second. We're gonna recap everything we did, and then next time we get together, we're just gonna start with that Berlin Conference, and we're gonna go from there. So let's go back to this global economy walkthrough through a class lens. Let's try to, if anyone out there wants to ask some questions, answer some questions, let's do it while we're here together. So yeah. Let me scroll down here. So we saw some of this extraction economy with like the gold coming out of Western Africa for European coinage. We haven't gotten to that Congo extraction with the rubber. That story's crazy. we saw some of this resource curse where like the slave trade, where the slave trade became so profitable, some nations and kingdoms didn't think to diversify their industries. Um, I was reading a little bit too. Like this is just Google AI, so of course, we'll have to dig deeper. But it talked about intense moral, religious, and humanitarian campaigns were one of the reasons like the British turned their back on slavery. But I bet you the real reason was mixed with that. They probably didn't want to fight that front anymore, like have that argument on the other side of slavery. But I bet you one of the real answers is really this economic shift answer. While debate exists, some argue that the profitability of slave-driven sugar plantations declined, and industrialization in Europe favored wage labor over slavery. Because wage labor essentially became a new form of creating slavery out of the population that was already around you, the labor forces that already existed. You didn't have to give any rights. They didn't have to own their own value. They just had to accept a certain type of wage, and then the same tactic that was being used abroad in terms of forced labor, corvée, unpaid or underpaid mandatory work, usually justified through taxes or legal requirements. Again, the taxes. If you have to own property tax on your home, or you have to buy food to feed your family, or anything like that, you have to come back to work. And if we pay you just enough so you can never get ahead on your own, then at least a majority of people who don't have the extra energy or the opportunity to go find ways to educate themselves or find another revenue stream are always going to be stuck to be there as a labor force for my commodities with my industrialization. Of course, later on, these industrialized countries move their manufacturing overseas to re-exploit a new population of people that don't have generations of people growing up at the factories. But very early on, I bet you that industrialization that was taking place in Europe was a bigger reason as to why like the slave trade people started turning their backs on the slave trade and why that fell apart. I bet you it wasn't as much to do with the moral argument. I'm sure there was some pressure from the moral argument, but I bet you more of it had to do with the fact that there was margins and profits to be made elsewhere. So just something to kind of note and think about as we keep moving on. We're gonna get into some real like colonization and like how the economy gets boiled. I thought we'd make it today. I didn't realize that video took so long to get there, and I do apologize. I wasn't gonna pre-watch it, but it's a 3.5 hour video, and like the parts I skimmed seemed pretty solid. I should have done better. I should have just stuck with some of the shorter videos that I was gonna lace together. That might be a better method for moving forward. AXJPEG, if you are out there, let me know what you thought. I felt like there were some down times where I wasn't talking enough, but that was just because I was listening and I had nothing to contribute to the conversation I was watching. So that's an L on me. I'll hold that. I'll be better for the next time. We're just trying to make progress. We're not chasing perfection. How much?
20.
So let's get in here. So Africa before the scramble. That's what we went through today. We talked about the Congo having a Christian kingdom and an ambassador to Rome, which is crazy to think about, like how there was like a relationship like that between Rome and Africa. I don't think we talk about it a lot because we compartmentalize Rome as one category, and then the only time we think about Africa, I feel like in like common discourse, one of the major times Africa really comes up is when it comes to like slavery. We always think of people like Zulu. Like we just think of like this. In my mind, what we talk about is like we think of roaming, almost hunter-gathering esque tribes like hunting each other down and forcing people into slavery, which was happening. But there was so much more than that. That's just like that's just one of the through lines, and that's just one of the facts. There's so many other variables and so many other facts out there that make the story so much more enriched and add so much more quality to it. You realize how much more potential opportunity, what was already happening, was already causing impacts. The fact that before we even think about like slave trade and like that with Rome, like the gold that ran this entire empire or ran the kingdoms of Europe was coming from like an African civilization. It wasn't even being extracted; it was being traded. You know, like that's something that we don't consider, and I don't think we put enough respect on Africa's name and the empires that came out of Africa. Um, quite frankly, I'm pretty sure he mentioned a lot of these. Ethiopia was mentioned as an ancient Christian kingdom, um, and it was never fully colonized, and that's interesting too because like that's like kind of where humans started. So I wonder, there seems to be like some mystique to some mythology with that with Ethiopia, like how it was never like really conquered. Zulu was a powerful military that defeated some British forces down in South Africa. We learned a little bit about that. What changed? Why was the scramble happen in the 1880s? We talked about the economic depression, even with like the Ottoman Empire. We talked about how the Ottoman Empire was kind of failing, how colonies and kingdoms within Africa were failing and weakened, in Morocco and even in the Congo and the central parts of Africa, in Eastern Africa. We haven't talked about these new guns, new technologies, but I will look that up. There's a book called Guns, not Guns, Drugs, and Alcohol. Guns, Germs, Guns. What is it called?
Something steel. Germs, guns, and
Yeah, something steel. Guns, Germs, Steel. I can't remember what it was, but it talks about how like technology was one of the major things that made colonization easier. Because like things like telegraph, that made it so like messages could be quicker. So like correspondence and directions could be giving in an actual time frame that made like colonization and because what's the difference between colonization and trade? Trade is like merchants and like controlling like having the better contract and making more money off of the business and the energy and the valuations that's going on there. Colonization is like full rule. Like you do what we say. You pay us direct taxes. Your existence is to benefit our kingdom and our empire. Which there's a blurry line, but there is definitely like colonization is like an in-depth for version of those trade towns out there in Africa. We had some new players. He didn't touch on that too much. I'll find a little video to supplement that. Here, let me take a note on what I got going on right here. We need one for. Page. Where's the? This here. We need one for this, one for that. And then this fear that powers, like we saw that with like the Dutch trading to the British, and he was even touching on how the British were responding to what the Germans did. We'll watch a little bit more of that because this is like I kind of messed up. Maybe I shouldn't have found some of this started so early because this is what really starts playing into like what lays out for World War II. And one is like these fear between powers and not having any trust. Because like really, if you think about it, Europe is like if you think of it as like a kumbaya type thing, the European nations are all right next to each other. They're thinking of each other as in some levels of brothers and sisters that had like civil trade. It almost didn't matter who was like, there would still be like a want to control and colonize. But as long as they were getting the cocoa and you were getting the rubber, you would still have like trade agreements. The fact that like they saw each other as inferior and one was better than the other amongst each other drove how they were colonizing Africa and their bloodthirst on like putting their roots and putting their power into the continent. And then I mentioned these weekend African states like the slave trade being destabilized, destroyed a lot of the economy around, and I think like in the same breath as like the technology stuff. It kind of seems like Africa, like they knew to trade gold, salt, and slaves, but I don't know if they knew what they were sitting on when it came to like other materials like rubber. I don't know if they like had seen or like knew of like the markets that like could have been exposed from the resources they held. So I don't even know like this like could it be like a study of like one of the first studies of like why it's so important to diversify your economy. So Europeans have trading posts off the coast. We've talked a lot about that. Transatlantic slave trade enriches European and American economies, devastates African societies, forces them to go to war with each other, to not trust each other. It gives them reasons to behead each other for money. We saw with like Ethiopia, like the only real African kingdom that was inland, that was controlled outside of Africa, was when Egypt was getting controlled by Muhammad Ali. And then we even talked about how the explorers were going back and telling the people in Europe what resources were where. So let's answer some of these questions, huh? So anyone can help answer these questions. Why did Europeans stick to the coast for 200 plus years? Was it disease, African military power, or was it because it wasn't profitable yet? It was easier, it was more cost effective to protect cities on the coast due to the advantage that colonizers had, the naval advantage that colonizers had. They just wanted to control trade. So there was no reason to go more inland. And then how did the slave trade weaken African kingdoms before colonization even started? Anybody out there got the answer? That's right. Because kingdoms in Africa had become dependent on slave trade for their economy, so when Britain decided to stop this trade, the kingdoms experienced a recession. Good answer, guys. And then where did the slave labor go? Where did the wealth from the slave labor go? It built the American South and enriched European trades and funded industrial revolutions. All of the above, right? I mean, it went to the European colonizers. And to Brazil. Brazil was a huge slave trade. I wonder, because like Brazil is in South America, right? And I think it was colonized by Spain. So I wonder if all the trade, like the slave trades that were going from Africa to Brazil, were still benefiting the Spanish. Does that make sense? I know that's like a loop-de-doop of thought. You know what I mean, though? Because like, who was in control of Brazil at the time Brazil was receiving all these slaves? I mean, that's the question, right? At least the question I'm posing. We'll have to look that in sometime. So, we can write this in a different color. Let's put it in blue. Because I jotted down some other topics that for later streams that we could look into. I don't remember everything I wrote. Like, I don't remember who they were. Oh. have it all. Man, some of these are probably not spelled right, but that's alright. The Modest Wars between Egypt and Britain. Oh, we gotta look up what the Arab slave trade was all about because it kept popping up, but I didn't know much about it. And then we already have this one on the docket, but we need to check out that Leopold. And was his buddy's name Stanley? Was that his? We gotta check out Stanley too. Stanley was an MF. I don't know if that's right, but we're maybe. So these are some more topics for us to check out later. We still have plenty to go through on this. Don't get me wrong, we're not done with Africa. We're actually really just getting started. That was really just majorly just the prologue. In fact, about 2 hours of prologue we went through today. I'm gonna make sure I resource my videos. I did do a lot of resourcing of videos before today, but I just like I said, I thought that 3 hour video was gonna be solid, and it's just too much information packed into for what we're doing here on the stream. I'm gonna find some stuff that's a little bit more easy to digest, and then after we do an easy to digest video, we'll dive into like a long form documentary on a certain topic. But once we know how that topic is like contextualized into the entire timeline, we'll try to stay away from just major timeline stuff over and over again, just because it's hard to keep track of, and that's not why we're here. I love that we did it though. I think it was worth I don't think we wasted anyone's time learning more about African history. It's just that I don't think it's conducive to what we got going on all the way. All right. So with all that, should we get into this? What is this new? We'll wait on that too. We'll wait. We'll wait till next time on that. So we'll wait till the next time to get into the scramble of Africa. That's going to be our next major topic. The next time we come about. Organize this all properly. I have some good stuff here. I hope you guys enjoyed that little walk through history a little bit. I enjoyed having you guys here. It was a good old time. And then I want to call you Apex JPEG so bad. AX JPEG, we need to figure out a way for like an outro out the stream too. You know what I'm saying? For like these moments right here. Because I feel like I could keep going, but I don't want to dive into something too much. We're already at the 2:22 mark, which is a good time. So we're just gonna say a little closing prayer, and then I'll be back out with you guys in the morning probably. What's tomorrow? Wednesday, and then if not, then I'll be back with you guys for sure on Friday. But now that I know, maybe I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter too. So we just do a little bit of history every day, and then we also do a little bit of like current events every day. That way we just keep it fresh and keep it popping. But I do think today went well. I think it was nice to be structured. We definitely had averaged over 3 viewers for the entire stream, which is awesome because that's the second of the 4 days that I need, and that's the last metric I need before affiliation. So that's awesome. So good things happen today, and we're learning. And I appreciate you, AXJPEG, for being there to help to learn and to apply some of that structure. And I just thank everyone to come out today, and thanks for everyone that joined the stream, that stayed and did stay, and it was a great day. So, dear God, thank you for today. Thank you for allowing me to use my voice. Thank you for allowing me to learn new things. Thank you for allowing me to live in such an awesome time where miracles happen every day, every second, every moment. Thank you for this family. Thank you for my friends. I pray for all those that are in need of a prayer. I pray for those that find themselves in dark situations. I pray that they're able to find your light. And I also pray for those that are creating dark situations, that they may turn their back on wicked ways and follow your lessons. Thank you for allowing me to be who I am. Thank you for my evolution. Thank you for this progress. I continue to ask that you just keep guiding me along my way. I pray that I'm able to achieve my mission and to reach my potential as a man and as a father. Thank you for just all the abundance, and thank you for the life, and thank you for these opportunities, the trials and the tribulations. Thank you for the ups, thank you for the downs, thank you for all the contrast and all the shades of gray. I pray that I'm able to continue to maneuver through this world and just bring more light and more opportunity and better outcomes to it. Thank you for blessing the road from us as you bless the one leave behind. And in your holy name and by your Son Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Peace, tribe.